Hello everyone, Zephan here. This is gonna be a little introduction or guide-ish thingy about what makes the simulation spreadsheet tick and unique. So first off, I'll explain the difference between a simulation and a model. The spreadsheet isn't really a simulation. I'm specifically talking about or comparing here a web app simulation compared to a spreadsheet model. A simulation has a few pros compared to a spreadsheet and vice versa as well. The pros are that you can see the deviation between the upper limit and the lower limit on average of DPS you'll get. So you can see the RNG component. For example, certain specs might have a lower average damage but have a higher potential RNG damage. Stuff like that isn't really shown in the spreadsheet model at the moment. Other things that are relevant or that are better or you could do better in a simulation model is that for proc related items, especially if you're using multiple of those, with them lining up and stuff like that, you would be able to get a better value of DPS compared to averaging them out in a mathematical model. The cons, however, of web app simulations is that you need to do multiple calculations. Essentially what you're doing, instead of using the average of crit, you're essentially rolling the dice every time and you're doing multiple iterations, and for doing this you need to do all the calculations each time, and you need to do a certain amount of iterations to get a accurate number. So that means a lot of computing power. So that means if you set up your variables, you'll then do the iterations, and if you want to change something of your variables, you'll need to do the calculation again, and which might take, depending, several seconds, minutes, or even longer, depending. Where a spreadsheet model, the calculations are done immediately, so if you toggle something, you'll immediately see the difference it made. The pros of spreadsheet models on average are that you get actually the true average. You're not dependent on the amount of iterations that you do, which results to lower computing power that is needed. Spreadsheets are also widely accessible in that you can see all the calculations that happen behind the scenes. So it's open source, so to speak. The main reason I'm using a spreadsheet or Google Sheets is that I don't know anything about coding, so there's no way for me to make a simulation or something like that. And it's also easily accessible for everyone as I'm using Google Sheets. Some cons are that you can't really set up the UI always like you like, because I'm limited to the cells and stuff. This isn't really a limit of models or mathematical models, but more so of using spreadsheets. And as said before, proc-related items might be slightly undervalued because of how different procs can line up together, right? Instead of just both being averaged out. So now specifically about my current model that I implemented, the Sprint and Marathon model, or SNM for short. I'll first talk about why it came to be. It isn't an invention from me specifically. It's something that the classic Warlock Discord came about back in, legacy or classic era theory crafting. What happened was, with my classic spreadsheet, you would have a lot of jigsaw bumps and stuff like that, and breakpoints, which came from either in very short fights, it would be the difference between casting a Shadow Bolt until you casted the next one, or for example, when you needed to life tap, when you would have a little bit more mana, you wouldn't need to life tap, which cost a breakpoint. So if you, for example, would equip a item with one more intellect, which would push off a life tap being needed and stuff like that, it would cause the DPS to go all over the place instead of smoothly lining up and stuff like that, which made it so that the stat weights weren't always accurate or the DPS value wasn't always accurate. This is nicely displayed here in this chart below. This chart is from, in orange you see the DPS from my original classic spreadsheet, and then during the theory crafting and testing of the model and stuff like that, Aix, one of the main guys that worked on that alongside with Dive and Woznia, he made a quick hack fix of my spreadsheet, wherein that he implemented the sprint and marathon model. And here you can see that the blue line is curving nicely, whilst you can see that my calculations are going all over the place. So if, for example, you would be simming here at 5 seconds, you would get a way lower value than you would at 6 seconds. Although, again, at 8 seconds, you would get the drop compared to 7 seconds and stuff like that, where here you can nicely see it scale up and then back down actually as the fight becomes longer and longer. You can also see that the deviation or the difference between the jumps becomes less and less as time goes on. That is because you're nearing a singularity point, so to speak, where if the fight is infinitely long, those the difference that life tap makes and your cast time makes and the amount of trinket uses you have becomes nil. But this is already kind of the case for the sprint and marathon model. So breakpoints, to recap, are a function of life taps, which is unique to Warlocks, of course. You also have unused trinkets. There wasn't really a thing done here for trinkets in this chart. So you can see here where there's a jump up for both each time. This is around when trinkets are used. In the current model for the Burning Crusade, this is also curved out, so to speak. And then the amount of casts. We'll go a bit how we'll go into it how this is overcome. So essentially, there are 3 things that need to be tackled, right? That is life taps, that is cast time, and that is unused items. These are the 3 things that essentially cause breakpoints, which could make it that items show as lower DPS whilst there or actually a DPS increase or vice versa. So what is done in the S&M model is that for overcoming life tap is that the DPS is split into 2 phases. So you have the sprint phase, hence the name, right? That is where you don't need to do any actual life tapping. So you have enough mana, etc. You don't need to life tap. That is one part of it. The other part is the marathon phase, in that you do need to life tap, and that is all the time you're actually doing DPS based on mana gain from life tapping. Then you have is the cast time of spells and stuff like that, and your actual rotation, and that is handled by using partial casts instead of only full casts. This is also a part of the marathon function, really, so you can't really do the marathon function without accounting for partial casts. Unused items also cause breakpoints, in that when you use them, you have X amount of time where you have 100% uptime, after which it's on cooldown, the uptime drops down. And this gives a lot of variations in those time points, right? So instead of using 100% uptime at X amount of time or 0 uptime at Y, there is a function to account for that and the average uptime, really. We'll get more in depth about that later. So about the first part, splitting the DPS into a sprint phase and a marathon phase. What is actually done? In the sprint phase is all the time you don't actually need to use life tap to supply your DPS or the mana for your DPS. So this is actually the length of time based on your base mana, everything from consumes you get from mana and buffs like that. MP5 is also included in this. So what is the time then you spend in marathon, or rather how is DPS in marathon calculated? And that is based on the cast time that is needed for the mana from life tap. Another part of it is marathon, of course. This is the time you spend. You have the fight duration, essentially. You have your sprint time. The remaining time, if you take the sprint time away from the fight duration, is the time you spend in marathon, essentially. In the actual game, when you're playing and stuff, these two sections won't be like two separate things in an actual fight. You'll be spending a bit sprinting and not needing to life tap, and you might life tap before you run out of mana, etc., because you're moving and stuff like that. But in the sim, this is split just into these two parts, although whilst in game they might be overlapping in certain parts. So how is the actual DPS calculated, and how does it differ from sprint? So first, what is DPS? It's damage per second, right? So essentially, if you know your damage and you know your cast time of a spell, you know the DPS of a certain spell, right? And that is how it is done in the sprint model, or in the sprint time section. That is that you calculate your DPS, or your damage rather, of a spell. You look at your cast time, which is influenced by haste and stuff like that. You divide one by the other and you get your actual DPS value. The same thing is done for the marathon DPS, but where a difference is that instead of just using your cast time, you add the time you would need to life tap to provide for the mana offset spell. So essentially what you do is you have your base cast time of your spell, and to that you add your mana cost divided by the mana you gain from life tap, right? Then you know how much life taps you need to do to get that mana. And to that, then you add the time it takes to cast a life tap, because there is also a time component to that. This is then added, this value then is added to the base cast time, and then you arrive at the cast time it takes for the spell to be cast in the marathon phase, right? If you take this marathon cast time and your actual damage, which is essentially the same as your sprint damage, and you divide it by your cast time, or your new cast time, you arrive at your marathon DPS. There's an example here below where, let's say, accounting for crits and hit and everything alike, your Shadow Bolt is doing 5,000 damage when it hits. So your cast time of your Shadow Bolt, talented, no haste or anything special like that, is 2.5 seconds, which results in doing 2,000 DPS in sprint. Now, if we look at marathon, a Shadow Bolt costs 420 mana. Let's say you gain 2,100 mana from doing a life tap, right? So if you then are looking at marathon, you know it costs 420 mana, 2,100 life tap, divide one by the other. You need 0.2 or 20% of a life tap to cast a Shadow Bolt, which means if you would be casting 5 Shadow Bolts, you need to life tap once, right? The cast time of life tap is a global cooldown, which is 1.5 seconds, which if you do 0.2 of a life tap by 1.5, you get 0.3 seconds. This is added to the base cast time of a Shadow Bolt, which means 2.5 seconds plus 0.3 seconds, resulting in 2.8 seconds, right? Which is your new marathon cast time, essentially. Which means the DPS for in your marathon phase for your Shadow Bolts on average is a bit lower than it is in sprint. In sprint you have 2,000 DPS, whilst in marathon you have 1,785 DPS for your Shadow Bolt in this example. But this is how you can see that depending, the longer the fight is, the more time you'll spend in the marathon section, because you eventually run out of mana and you need to do life taps more often, which lowers your DPS. So that was one part of it. That is kind of looking at how marathon DPS and sprint DPS is calculated in the base sense, without going too in depth into how the damage calculation is. So there is still a question of how much do you cast, what spell and stuff like that, right? So there are a couple of different cast time percentages used to determine how much of what is essentially cast in the spreadsheet. For doing this, there are two different things that we kind of have to divide out of different types of spells. You have your non-filler spells, which are things like curses or immolate or shadow burn if you want to use it on cooldown, stuff like that. And you have your filler spells, which is essentially the spell you use to fill up the rest of the time between your dots and your other stuff. It's the time you're spending Shadow Bolt or Incinerate or using Seed of Corruption, for example. Those are your filler spells. So first off, what we need to do is determine how much time is actually needed of the fight to use your non-filler spells. For this, you need to kind of look at, okay, how long does a spell take to cast? And how long is a spell active before I need to refresh it? Or is it on cooldown or something, right? So that is the cast time divided by the duration of the dot or until it needs to be refreshed or whatever, right? And that will result in a certain percentage for a spell, right? So that amount of time is needed, or that percentage of time in a fight is needed to keep up set debuff or whatever, right? And then all the rest of the time, if you add up all your non-filler spells, like for example, you add up the time you need to cast your curse, immolate, and corruption, you add those three up together, you have 100%, that much percentage of time goes to non-filler spells, all the rest is filler. Let's say that is 30% of your time you're casting non-filler spells like corruption and stuff, you're casting 17% of the time filler spells like Shadow Bolt. The bottom section here, DPS compared to fight length, that is mostly about, you look at how much DPS your spell does, you method that out, and then you do that times the time of percentage you're casting that spell, and that arrives at the DPS you're gaining from said spell. So here we have an example. Let's say for our non-filler spell, we're using Immolate, right? The cast time of Immolate is 1.5 seconds. It's up for 15 seconds, which means 10% of the time. We take 100% of the time, we remove 90% from that. We're 90% of the time using filler spells. So if we now look at how much DPS we're actually doing with our filler spell over the entire fight duration, let's say we're using the 2000 DPS from in sprints before, we are casting that spell 90% of the time, we're gaining 1800 DPS from our filler spell, Shadow Bolt in this case, or in this example. Now we know how to determine how much time we're casting which spells, how much time we are spending in sprint and marathon, and we know how the DPS is calculated for both, right? So how does this all add up to come to a total DPS value? Because now they are all standalone, kind of semi-intertwined with the filler time and the non-filler time. So let's go over how all this actually comes together. For your sprint DPS, what you essentially have is the time you spent in sprint and the sprint relevant DPS. You're looking at the DPS from your non-filler spells and from your sprinting filler spells. The same for marathon essentially, and those two are each time added up. And then you look at the time you'll spend in both of those sections, which sprint DPS is just all the time you actually have free casting, so to speak, without needing to live tab. And then the same is done for marathon, except marathon is the time you're actually not in sprint of your total fight length. And then your total DPS is your total from in sprint and your total from in marathon. So let's talk about unused effects and items, such as trinkets and flame cap and stuff like that. Here we have a graph. Why? Because this graph might better explain it than I can do it properly myself. But let's get into what is actually displayed on this graph and the different colors. At the bottom, you have the time frame, right? And at the left, at its axis, you can actually see the stats that are derived. If you would add up the stats every seconds of these items, you can see those. So this makes it so that for static items like tier, which don't have unused effects, you can also graph them out, right? So the blue represents a static item, or trinket rather, so it's just stats and nothing else, and it goes up into infinity, and just it's always adding the same stat over and over. All right. At the red, we have a unused trinket with some static stats on it as well, and here we can see it goes quickly up in stats. This is during the unused time, and then it drops down again. That's or rather, it still goes up, but at a slower rate because it's just the static values. And you can see this repeating and repeating and repeating and repeating. Well, there is this weird thing with, you can see here that the red part is most of the time a bluff, or the unused trinket is more valuable than the static trinket most of the time, as here you can see. It's only near the end that it dips a little bit below the line, and at that point you would see in a spreadsheet or something like that that is using static values, you'll see that at that point it seems like the static trinket is better than the unused trinket. And all the time before it you would see the reverse, and then a few seconds later you would again see the unused trinket being better. This is kind of what we call a breakpoint, in that it's switching between the two, although probably on average higher uptime on one. What we can do is say, or what the first thought once was that I had is, well, let's take the time the trinket is active and the time it's on cooldown, divide one by the other, and we arrive at an uptime. And we indeed arrive at an uptime. That's the yellow graph here that we can see. But this graph isn't really all that useful. Why? Because it's actually the minimum time, or the minimum time the trinket ever would be active. So it only interacts here when you're starting a new trinket, so when you arrive at the total cooldown time. But all the time before that, you're actually having a higher uptime, but that isn't represented in this. So you're essentially undervaluing your trinket. It's not something you want to do, as it doesn't arrive anything that you can compare with. It's good if the fight length would be infinitely long and you would only be looking at marathon DPS, so to speak. But that's not what we are doing. We want to value sprint DPS, we want to value marathon DPS. We want to value our trinkets not as if the fight is infinitely long, because there are certain points where a unused trinket might be better because it starts with the higher uptime, and the longer the fight is, the average uptime will be lower, right? At which point the static trinket could overtake the unused trinket, or vice versa. So the yellow line is minimum uptime. It's not really all that useful. So what do we want to do is we want to look at the time the graph is actually going up, and then at the time it's just static values or no unused effects, right? And we kind of want to arrive at the average of this. So if you would be looking at all these little triangles of the unused, you would want to take the average of that. And if you would take an infinite long fight, that average would eventually come down to the minimum uptime. But at the start, it would be way higher, because shorter fight length, the unused effect is more prominent, right? And that is essentially what this green line is. And this is the formula that is used in the spreadsheet. And I'll show it in a second. And lo and behold, what can we see? That the static trinket around this time point here, around 350 seconds, around a fight that would take that long, that the static trinket actually overtakes the unused trinket. Why? Because the average uptime of the trinket drops down the longer the fight is. And all the time before, it's clearly better. And only after that point, it's worse, and it's never reverts to that. Whilst here, we can still see, if you would be using static values for your trinkets or something like that, that at if you would be looking at a spreadsheet or something, at all these time points here, it's slightly better, then it's worse again, etc., etc. And this will go on for a very long time until it eventually averages out. But by averaging out the uptime of the trinket, you can already arrive at that way sooner without introducing any form of breakpoints of this sort. So, to the uptime formula that is used for this to derive the average uptime, Ghost all did that. It's placed here. I'm not going to fully explain it here in depth, but essentially what is done is that you look at the curvature, or rather the time it's active, the time it's not active, and the time or the length of the fight, and based on that you arrive at an average uptime. So one thing that we did add to it is that you can see here it's going up just like a unused trinket would be doing, and at the point the deviation starts, or from a normal uptime, we kind of split off, which is at a halfway point, and follow with the other formula. So at this point you would have 100% uptime, and then it would drop down to 99.9%, etc., etc., and going down. And eventually, if you would graph it out into infinity, you would eventually arrive at the yellow line, which is the minimum uptime. That's what this line actually represents, or the uptime percentage that is used in the spreadsheet. So, if you look at all these different formulas and stuff like that, the sprint and marathon model, how partial spells are used instead of full cast spells, and how these unused trinkets and effects and stuff like Bloodlust and Flame Cap and etc. all are used, you can see we arrive, if we would graph out the DPS, at something like this. Instead of all jagged and stuff like that, you're getting smooth lines. And what do we see here at these lines? We're at 10 seconds here. We're using an unused trinket of 20 seconds. So it's having 100% uptime until 10 seconds, at which point the uptime starts to drop down. And that's what we see here. The same thing here happens around 40 seconds. This is actually the time Bloodlust is up and stuff like that. After which it goes down further and further. And why does it drop further down? Because, well, the uptime of the trinkets are getting lower, and you're starting to actually go into the sprint and marathon phase, at which point your DPS also drops, or rather into the marathon phase, at which point your DPS also starts to drop down. So if we add up onto this, I know this graph has a lot on it, but if you would be looking at stat weights, you see that the stat weights are fairly not that much moving and stuff like that. And what can you see here at around, 85 seconds or something like that? We can see MP5 getting value and mana getting value. And the value of certain spell power variations dropping off very limited. This is because the marathon phase actually starts here. So if you would have a little bit more MP5, the marathon phase would be held off a little bit longer, which means we can calculate what the actual value is of MP5, for example. The reason that demon or spell power versus undead or demons drops a little bit off from normal damage, which it is before, is because it doesn't influence life tap, for example. And the longer the fight is, you'll see, the more you'll need to life tap, the more value normal spell damage has compared to spell damage from undead, whilst in sprint it's the same value. That was it. That is how all this math is done, or what the model actually does, and what the results are. I hope it didn't raise more questions than you had before, but that's about it. I still want to thank everyone that helped along with the spreadsheet until now, and also everyone that actually actually theory crafted the sprint and marathon model, S&M model, which is Dive, Aches, and Chainsaw back in the day. I'm probably forgetting more people, but without him, this model would never have come to be. And it's really just significantly, I find it, superior for gearing compared to what I actually use in Classic, in that there are no breakpoints and you don't have the weird occasion where you might think, okay, X item is giving me more DPS, so it should be better, just because you're using one less life tap, although it isn't actually, in 99.9% of the cases, it isn't actually better, but it's just one of those breakpoints. So yeah, that was it.